Thank you. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I was just saying, if you didn't hear me, that I was happy actually both presentations, but particularly the last one that speaks to the significance of the funding, or in this case, like the private financing dimension. So I'm gonna take a critical perspective on the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And yes, in case you didn't hear me, thank you to the organizers, et cetera. Okay. Um, I'm happy to talk about the Canada Infrastructure Bank because I've been doing research on the CIB for a number of years. It's been sort of stalled out for some time, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the things it aims to do than the things that it actually has done thus far. But it's also a little bit odd being invited to speak on at a public banks workshop on the CIB because according to the earlier definition that we heard of public banks, it's not really a bank in a sense. I mean, it does depend on how you define it, but I consider it more a conduit for private finance than a public bank proper. And it's also, in particular, the CIB is also a vehicle for enabling a particular political agenda at the national level that I would argue favors not the public interest, though this is present in the different documents that are published by the CIB, but instead it's favoring a political agenda of privatization through private finance and public-private partnerships, private equity taking in public infrastructure. So speaking to P3, Public-Private Partnership, P3 insiders at a Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships event in November 2020, Aaron Corey promised that the CIB would, quote, start with the market and work backwards by, quote, soliciting partnerships rather than waiting for offers. So this sort of flips the usual discourse on its head, that it would kind of wait for I guess, infrastructure projects that the federal government wants to advance or that other municipalities want to take part in. And instead, it's going to be now a conduit for the as a kind of first start. And indeed, in the 2020 to 2025 corporate plan, the CIB states that it intends to be, quote, opening new markets for private sector participation in projects in Canada through, quote, revenue generating infrastructure. How will it do this, or how does it do this? By, quote, moving the Canada infrastructure market towards increased risk transfer and attracting private capital. So as I mentioned earlier, there are public interest aims, and these quotes that I just provided, I think, contradict other parts of the corporate plan, which state that the CIB is interested in targeting development projects in the public interest. And these would be in areas prioritized by the federal government. So this would be areas like transit, green infrastructure, infrastructure for First Nations communities, et cetera. And so the Canada Infrastructure Bank was then the subject of a parliamentary committee investigation in 2021, and I took part, a small role in that. And through the proceedings, the committee came to a and it suggested scrapping the Canada Infrastructure Bank. But instead, the Liberals have doubled down. And so one big change since the 2021 parliamentary committee hearings is that in the most recent federal budget, Budget 2022, there's an expanded role for the CIB now through this, through enabling it to invest in private sector-led projects. So not just public-private partnerships as we originally understood them to be, like public infrastructure that's then has some element of private equity and private finance, but instead these are private sector-led projects through and through. And so the budget describes this as the impact of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And so obviously this is clearly in opposition to the committee's recommendation that the CIB be abolished. So using public money to de-risk private investments and allowing the Canada Infrastructure Bank to invest in private sector-led projects and encouraging these projects through taxpayer-funded risk-taking are clearly worrisome developments. And this is happening simultaneous to, in the UK, we see the Private Finance Initiative, PFI, being handed the scheme of PFI handback. And we see other jurisdictions around the world canceling public-private partnerships given the high cost of private financing and the now decades-long established track record of high costs associated with private financing and the burdens of flimsy risk transfer justifications, and so on. And so the CIB is really striving to institutionalize this P3 bias, I guess one could say, in various Canadian jurisdictions, and now kind of institutionalizing this tired, bygone era. So not only is risk transfer a fiction because risk is really sold or purchased rather than transferred in some way, like as if the responsibility evaporates. It's actually taken on for a premium by the private sector. And in times of upheaval, we see that the public sector backstop is always available. And this was made clear during the pandemic crisis, and of course the climate crisis demonstrates the need for new thinking and new approaches, and infrastructure bank in the public sector in the public interest. We also know that the Bank of Canada has signaled that interest rates are going to probably keep rising for some time to come in order to fight inflation. And so private finance cost pressures will surely add to the public obligations that we have for infrastructure under the CIB. So there's really 5 main concerns, and I can go into more detail or less. I'm not sure how much time I have. Okay, well, I'm just going to not go into much detail then, because then I'd like to also talk about what we can do in a more progressive way. But so the 5 main concerns, just to encapsulate it, are more expensive as P3 with private debt financing. This is because the government can borrow more cheaply. Second is that these projects transfer project control and revenue from the public realm to the realm of private investors. And so infrastructure is then repositioned as an asset class, not a public service. Third is that these projects privilege areas of revenue generation rather than those areas that might be more socially needed. And so user fees are a main way of recouping revenue here, or of enlivening the interests of investors. Fourth is that institutional pathways for equity taking and selling are entrenched where they previously were ad hoc. And so these equity holders' interests are consequential because they decide to a large extent how the operations and service and maintenance, et cetera, are run. And so it's not, infrastructure is very much services during the operational component, for the multi-decade operational component. And finally, the Canada Infrastructure Bank clearly corporatizes federal level decision-making on infrastructure spending. An arm's length agency with a board of directors who are primarily chosen for their expertise in private finance, real estate investment, that's the background of the Canada Infrastructure Bank personnel, and not necessarily those who are public servants or those with public sector expertise, though there are a few there. Okay, so with this in mind, I'll just conclude with this issue of building a progressive future that we're all interested in. And so I think it's plain, hopefully I've made my case, that linking private equity and commercialized infrastructure undermines other areas of the Canada Infrastructure Bank mandate, like operating in the public interest. And so we need the Canada Infrastructure Bank, if it's not going to be scrapped, if that's not in the Liberals' interests. We need this public bank at the federal level, this like infrastructure bank, to be a knowledge pooling bank, to pool talent, to better understand how to generate within the public sector and within the public interest efficiencies and learning on how to deliver infrastructure in those priority areas. I think we can probably all agree that green, transit, first infrastructure and so on are worthy aims, and so we need a knowledge bank in that sense. And so Canada then should be taking steps to control or bar equity sales to avoid a future where public infrastructure is exposed to remote investor decision-making and profit-making that relies on user fees, regressive user fees, or with offshore revenue loss for communities and distorted value for money and lack of accountability. So locating new, different, or even existing revenue sources is needed. If we are going to have user fees, something like tolls on highways could instead be used to subsidize public transit rather than being taken to line investors' pockets. The Canada Savings Bond, it could be reinvigorated or sort of repositioned. So Canada Savings bonds were issued every year from 1945 to 2017, and they're now canceled, but infrastructure funds generated on Wall Street and infrastructure banks coming from companies registered in tax havens are fully welcome in Canada. So there's a clear discrepancy. Pooled savings like pensions, unemployment insurance, and sovereign wealth funds attached to natural resource revenue, to the extent that that exists, could also easily be drawn in through the Canada Infrastructure Bank and used in more progressive ways. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.